Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the warm, slightly greasy paper wrapper on something you have absolutely eaten more of than you'd ever confess at a dinner party. The great American fast food empire. Not the shiny commercials with the glistening burgers that look nothing like whatever lands in your lap. Not the smiling clown or the friendly colonel. I mean the real story, the boardroom betrayals, the secret recipes locked away in actual vaults, the lawsuits over whether beef is technically beef, and the men who built billion-dollar kingdoms out of chopped meat and hot oil. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. These ideas of yours are the whole reason this little corner keeps growing, and I really do read every single one. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the exact hour when a drive-through would be a genuinely terrible decision. You can also find these episodes over on Spotify now, link in the description, if you'd rather drift off with your eyes already shut. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable. And while you do, let yourself wonder a little. Have you ever thought about who actually invented the assembly line burger, and whether that person got rich or got robbed? Did the Colonel really cook chicken, or was he mostly a man in a white suit with staggeringly good branding? Why is there a clown, and why has no one ever seriously questioned the clown? What exactly is in the sauce, and why does your body crave it at 11 at night, for reasons it flatly refuses to explain? Could you have survived a business dinner in 1961 across the table from a man who smiled warmly while quietly buying your life's work out from under you? Tonight we follow the whole strange, delicious, deeply unsettling story from the very first milkshake machine. So get cozy, because the arches are already glowing on the horizon, and somewhere the fryer is heating up. Our story doesn't start with a burger. It starts with a machine that made milkshakes, 5 at a time, and a travelling salesman named Ray Kroc who was selling them out of the trunk of his car with limited success. Kroc was in his early 50s, tired, and running out of runway. The kind of man who had chased a dozen business ideas and watched most of them fizzle. Then one day an order came in from a little restaurant out in San Bernardino, California, run by 2 brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald. They didn't want 1 machine, they wanted 8. Kroc did the math, realised that meant this tiny roadside stand was somehow blending 40 milkshakes at once, and thought the same thing you would think. That cannot possibly be right. So he got in the car to go see it for himself, and what he found there would quietly rearrange the eating habits of the entire planet. You have to understand what Kroc's life looked like before this moment, because it was not the life of a man about to build an empire. It was the life of a man who sold paper cups for years, then bet everything on the milkshake mixer, then watched sales dry up as competitors flooded the market. He had ulcers. He had lost most of his thyroid and his gallbladder. He was by most measures a slightly wheezing 60% of the way to retirement salesman, with a briefcase and a persistent cough. In modern terms, he was the guy still cold calling long after everyone else had moved on to something easier, refusing to admit the party was over. But that order for 8 mixers gnawed at him. No single restaurant needed to make 40 milkshakes at once. That was not a restaurant. That was a factory pretending to sell lunch. Curiosity, and probably a little desperation, put him on a plane, and then behind the wheel of a rental, driving out to the desert to see this impossible little operation with his own eyes. When he arrived, he didn't find a fancy sit-down establishment. He found a small, clean, almost humble building with an enormous line of people snaking out from it, and food coming out so fast that the line barely stood still. There were no car hops, no waitresses balancing trays, no teenagers loitering for hours over a single soda. There was just speed and volume and the strange sight of ordinary families walking away happy within minutes. Kroc stood in that parking lot and felt something he had not felt in years, He felt the future. Here is the part worth sitting with tonight. Kroc did not invent any of it. He did not design the kitchen. He didn't write the menu. He did not dream up the system. He was, at that moment, simply a salesman admiring somebody else's brilliant idea. Everything that made the operation extraordinary already existed, built and perfected by two brothers who were perfectly content with their single, successful stand in the California sun. What Kroc had was different. He had the hunger of a man out of second chances, and he had a vision of that little building copied 1,000 times over, glowing beside every highway in the country. The brothers saw a great restaurant. Kroc saw an empire. And that difference in imagination, more than any recipe, is what would change everything. To understand what he was really looking at, we have to step inside and meet the two men who built it. When Ray Kroc pulled up to that stand in San Bernardino, he watched something he'd never seen before, and it nearly stopped his heart. The McDonald brothers had thrown out almost everything a normal restaurant had. No waitresses, no plates, no cutlery, no long menu, no jukebox to attract loitering teenagers. Instead, they had a short menu, dirt-cheap prices, and a kitchen that ran like a factory floor. Burgers came out in seconds. Customers lined up around the building. The brothers had already figured out the thing Kroc would spend the rest of his life taking credit for, and they had done it years earlier in the sleepy quiet of the California desert, with no idea that the friendly salesman admiring their operation was about to change their lives in ways they would spend decades regretting. Richard and Morris, known to nearly everyone as Dick and Mac, were not reckless dreamers. They were careful, practical men who had already run a fairly ordinary drive-in restaurant with car hops and a big menu, the kind of place you would recognize instantly from any 1940s postcard, and it worked well enough. But they noticed something that most restaurant owners would have ignored. Most of their money came from hamburgers, not from the endless list of other items. The car hops were slow and expensive. Teenagers were treating the place like a hangout rather than a business. The dishes kept breaking. The whole thing was, in a word, inefficient. So they did something genuinely radical. They shut the entire restaurant down. On purpose. At the peak of its success, they closed the doors, gutted the operation, and rebuilt it from scratch around a single question. What if we removed everything that slowed us down? Out went the car hops, out went the plates and the glassware and the metal cutlery, replaced with paper and disposable packaging, which sounds obvious now but was close to heresy then. Out went the sprawling menu, trimmed down to a tight lineup of a few items people actually bought. The price of a hamburger dropped to something almost shockingly low, low enough that a family could feed everyone without a second thought. And the food would be ready not in the leisurely 15 or 20 minutes people were used to, but in well under a minute. The gamble was terrifying. When they reopened, the loyal car hop crowd was baffled and at first unimpressed. There were no friendly girls bringing food to your window. You had to walk up and order it yourself, like some kind of peasant. For a short while, business actually dipped, and you can imagine the brothers standing in that quiet kitchen, wondering if they had just set fire to their own livelihood. Then the crowds came back, and they came back different. Families, workers on a lunch break, kids, regular people who did not want a social experience, they wanted good food, cheap and fast, with no fuss and no waiting. Word spread. The lines grew, and that little building started generating the kind of volume that required, among other things, 8 milkshake machines running at once. The brothers had accidentally invented the template for modern fast food, and they were happily, contentedly small about it. They were making excellent money, living comfortably, and had no burning desire to conquer the nation. They liked their one restaurant. They liked their life. That contentment was their great strength, and, ultimately, their great vulnerability. because a man was already standing in their parking lot who wanted something they had never wanted, and to understand what he saw, we need to look closely at the machine they had built inside. Let's talk about the actual invention, because the burger was never the clever part. The clever part was the choreography. The brothers had studied their own kitchen the way an engineer studies a machine, timing every motion, removing every wasted step, and rebuilding the whole thing around raw speed. They called it the Speedy Service System, and it turned cooking into an assembly line long before anyone thought that was normal. One person grilled, one person dressed the buns, one person wrapped, one person handled the fries, and nobody thought about anything except their single job. It was Henry Ford's factory, except the product was lunch, and it was ready before you finished counting out your change. It was brilliant, it was a little bit dystopian, and it was about to be copied across every highway in America. The genius went deeper than just dividing up the work. The brothers obsessed over the physical layout of the kitchen itself. The story goes that they took their entire staff out to a nearby tennis court, and using chalk, drew a full-sized outline of their proposed kitchen right there on the ground. Then they had the workers mime their jobs, walking through the imaginary space, grabbing imaginary buns and flipping imaginary patties, while the brothers watched and took notes. Whenever two people bumped into each other, or someone had to take an extra step or a movement felt clumsy, they erased the chalk and redrew it. They rehearsed a restaurant like a stage play until the choreography was flawless. This is the part that gets lost when people picture fast food as something crude and thoughtless. The early system was the opposite of thoughtless. It was engineered with a precision that would make a modern efficiency expert weep with joy. Every tool was placed exactly where a hand would reach for it. Custom equipment was designed and built to their specifications, including special dispensers that squirted the exact same amount of ketchup and mustard every single time, so that no worker had to think or guess. Consistency was the whole point. A burger made on a slow Tuesday would be identical to a burger made during the lunch rush, and that consistency created something the food world had never really had before: predictability. In the old model, a restaurant was a gamble. The cook might be having a bad day, the portions might vary, the wait might be endless. The brothers' system removed the human variables almost entirely. You were no longer trusting a cook. You were trusting a machine, and the machine happened to be made of people performing tiny, repeatable tasks. There is, of course, a slightly unsettling flip side to all this brilliance, and it is worth naming. The system worked precisely because it did not require skilled cooks. It required people who could be trained in an afternoon to do one narrow task very quickly. The craft of cooking, the years of learning and intuition, was engineered right out of the equation. That was a feature, not a flaw. It meant labour was cheap, interchangeable, and easy to replace, which is a wonderful quality if you own the restaurant, and a considerably less wonderful one if you are the person squirting the exact same amount of mustard 800 times a day. But nobody was thinking about that yet. What everyone could see was that this system produced good, cheap food faster than seemed physically possible, and it did it reliably, and it did it at scale. It was a printing press for hamburgers, and a printing press in the right hands does not stay in one small building in the desert. Somebody was about to realize that the most valuable thing here was not the food at all. Here is the secret that would make the whole empire actually work, and it has almost nothing to do with food. In the early years, selling franchises barely made any money, and the company was quietly drowning. Then a sharp financial mind named Harry Sonneborn looked at the books and said something that sounds insane until you understand it. We're not in the burger business, we're in the real estate business. The idea was simple and ruthless. The company would buy or lease the land, then rent it back to the franchisee at a markup forever. Suddenly, every new restaurant wasn't just selling burgers, It was paying rent to headquarters. The food was almost a distraction. The empire was built on dirt, mortgages, and a landlord who happened to sell fries. To appreciate how clever this was, you have to understand the problem it solved. When Ray Kroc started selling franchises, he was making almost nothing on each one. The deal gave franchisees the right to use the name and the system in exchange for a tiny slice of their sales, and that tiny slice spread across a handful of restaurants barely kept the lights on at headquarters. Kroc was building something enormous and going broke doing it, which is a special kind of nightmare. He had the vision and the momentum and almost no money, like a man sprinting downhill who suddenly realizes he cannot feel his legs. Sonneborn, a quiet finance man, saw the escape hatch that Kroc had missed. Stop thinking about the pennies from each hamburger. Think about the ground the restaurant stands on. The company would take control of the real estate, either buying the land outright or locking in long leases, and then it would lease that land to the franchisee at a higher rate. The franchisee got a proven location. The company got a steady, reliable, ever-growing river of rent that had nothing to do with how many milkshakes anybody sold on a given afternoon. It gets better or worse, depending on which side of the counter you're standing on. Because the company controlled the property, it gained enormous power over the franchisees. Rent could be structured to rise with sales, behave badly, cut corners, or damage the brand, and you could find your lease in jeopardy, which meant losing not just your business but the very ground it sat on. The land was the leash. It kept thousands of independent owners marching in perfect step, terrified of losing everything, all without headquarters having to flip a single burger. Over the decades, this quiet strategy turned the company into one of the largest holders of commercial real estate on Earth. Read that again. A hamburger chain became a global property empire that happened to have restaurants on its land. The burgers, the fries, the shakes, all the things you actually think of when you picture the brand, became in some ways the marketing department for a colossal landlord. There is a strange beauty to it, and a strange coldness. The thing customers loved, the food, was almost beside the point at the highest level. The thing that generated the real, durable, world-conquering wealth was invisible to anyone standing in line. You came for a cheeseburger. You were, without ever knowing it, a tiny contributor to a real estate portfolio spanning the planet. Kroc understood exactly what he had. He is said to have told business students, only half joking, that his true business was real estate, and that the burgers merely produced the cash to buy more land. But an empire needs more than land and a system. It needs a face, a story, a character people can love. And a very different founder, in a very different corner of the country, was about to supply one. Now let's meet another founder, one whose face you would recognize instantly, and who spent most of his life failing spectacularly. Harlan Sanders was not born a colonel, did not serve as a colonel, and did not command a single soldier. The title was honorary, handed to him by the state of Kentucky, and he simply decided to become the character full-time, white suit, string tie, cane, and all. But before the fame, Sanders had already been a farmhand, a streetcar conductor, a railroad worker, an insurance salesman, a ferry operator, a tire salesman, and a lawyer who reportedly ended his own legal career by getting into a fistfight with his own client in a courtroom. The man was in his 60s, running a gas station that happened to serve fried chicken before anything finally went right. And even that came with a body count. Let's linger on that resume, because it is genuinely astonishing. Most people try 1 or 2 careers in a lifetime. Sanders collected them like a man who could not stop changing lanes on the highway of employment. He left home young after his father died, and his mother remarried. and from there his working life reads like a list of jobs a screenwriter would reject for being too unrealistic. He worked the fields. He lied about his age to join the army as a teenager. He shoveled coal. He studied law by correspondence and actually practiced it, right up until, as the story goes, he came to blows with the very client he was representing, which is a fairly definitive way to end a legal career. He sold insurance until he was let go. He ran a ferry boat operation. He tried to sell a manufactured lamp that did not sell. He operated a service station during the Great Depression, which was roughly the worst possible time to operate anything. Failure was not an occasional visitor in Harlan Sanders' life. Failure was a roommate who never paid rent and always ate the last of the food. And yet, at the gas station, something small and important happened. Travellers passing through were hungry, and there were no good places to eat nearby. So Sanders, who could cook, started serving meals to them. Not from a restaurant at first, but from his own living quarters attached to the station. Fried chicken, country ham, vegetables, biscuits. Real food, the kind that made tired travellers remember the place and tell their friends. Word got around. The food became the reason people stopped, not the gasoline. Here is the thing worth remembering as you drift off. Sanders did not stumble into his one good idea until an age when many people are thinking about slowing down. He was not a young prodigy with a brilliant plan. He was a stubborn, weathered, endlessly restless man who had been knocked down more times than he could count, and simply refused to accept that the count was final. The white suit and the courtly southern gentleman persona came later, carefully cultivated once the honorary colonel title arrived. He leaned into it so completely that he essentially erased the rough, brawling, luckless man underneath and replaced him with a beloved grandfather figure, all twinkle and warmth. It was a piece of personal branding decades ahead of its time, but that gentle image hid some genuinely hard edges, and one of the hardest came years before the fame, on a lonely Kentucky roadside, over something as small and stupid as a painted sign. Because before Harlan Sanders was the smiling face on the bucket, he was a man standing in the middle of a very real gunfight. Yes, a body count. Back in the 1930s, Harlan Sanders was running a service station and selling his chicken to travellers along a rural Kentucky highway. A competitor across the way kept painting over Sanders's advertising signs, which in the modern world would earn you a strongly worded post online. In 1930s Kentucky, it earned you a gunfight. Sanders and two representatives from an oil company drove out to repaint a sign. The competitor was waiting, and shots were fired in broad daylight. When the smoke cleared, one of the oil company men was dead, the competitor was wounded, and the future face of a global chicken brand had been standing in the middle of an actual shootout over a painted advertisement. The friendly grandfather on the bucket had a considerably rougher origin story than the branding suggests. To understand how a sign led to a killing, you have to understand what a sign meant back then. There were no phones in every pocket, no reviews, no digital maps guiding travellers to your door. If you ran a business on a highway, your advertising was often a hand-painted board pointing hungry, tired drivers toward your station. That sign was your lifeline. Whoever controlled the signs along the road controlled the flow of customers, and that flow of customers was the difference between eating and starving during the leanest years the country had ever seen. Sanders had a rival who ran a competing station, and the two men were locked in a bitter feud over exactly this. The rival, according to the accounts that survived, took to defacing Sanders's signs, painting over them to steer business away. Sanders, a man who we have already established did not have a long fuse, was not going to let that stand. The confrontation came to a head when Sanders and two men from an oil company set out to repaint one of the disputed signs. The rival was there, and so were his associates, and the argument became something far worse than an argument. Gunfire erupted on the roadside. One of the oil company men was fatally shot. In the chaos, Sanders reportedly returned fire and the rival was wounded. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. The kindly colonel, the man who would one day beam out from millions of buckets and cardboard signs, whose entire public image was built on old-fashioned warmth and hospitality, had once stood on a dusty highway, trading gunshots with a business competitor. A man died. This was not a metaphor about cutthroat competition. This was cutthroat competition with actual bullets. The rival ultimately faced legal consequences for the death, and Sanders, by the accounts that remain, was not charged for his role, the shooting deemed to fall on the other side of the feud. He went back to his station. He went back to his chicken. And in the retelling of his life story over the following decades, this violent chapter was quietly smoothed away, folded into the past, replaced by the gentle, avuncular figure the world would come to adore. That is the recurring theme in the story of these empires. The images are so warm and familiar that it becomes genuinely difficult to picture the grinding, sometimes brutal reality underneath them. A clown, a grandfather, golden arches glowing softly at dusk. It all feels designed to make you forget that behind every one of these brands were real, flawed, often ruthless human beings clawing their way up through desperate times. Sanders survived the feud, survived the depression, and eventually perfected the one thing that would finally make him famous. And he guarded the secret of it with a fervour that bordered on paranoia. Let's talk about the recipe, because the secrecy around it borders on the theatrical. The blend of 11 herbs and spices that Sanders perfected is treated less like a cooking instruction and more like a nuclear launch code. The original handwritten recipe is kept locked away, guarded, and, according to the company, never held in one complete place by any single supplier. Different companies are said to blend separate portions so that no one manufacturer ever knows the full formula. There are stories of the document being moved under heavy security like a visiting head of state. All of this to protect the seasoning on fried chicken. It is a wonderful bit of mythology, and whether or not it is truly unguessable, it worked. Because here you are, decades later, still wondering what is in it. The origin of the recipe itself is charmingly low-tech. Sanders spent years tinkering with his seasoning at the service station, adjusting it by taste and instinct, until he landed on a combination he was convinced no one could beat. The other half of his breakthrough was not the spices at all, but the method. He began using a pressure cooker to fry the chicken, which cooked it faster and, he believed, kept it juicier than the slow pan frying everyone else relied on. Speed and flavour together. The same twin obsessions driving every empire in this story. But it was the aura of secrecy that turned a good recipe into a legend. The company has cultivated the mystery with the dedication of a magician who will never explain the trick. The tale of the recipe being split among separate suppliers so that no single company ever sees the whole thing, is the corporate equivalent of storing half a treasure map with one guardian and half with another. It may well be true. It is also, undeniably, an extraordinary piece of marketing, because it transforms a jar of seasoning into a mystery worthy of a spy novel. Over the years, the security around the original document has become part of the folklore. There are accounts of the handwritten page being relocated with armed guards and elaborate precautions, treated with a seriousness usually reserved for state documents or crown jewels. The number itself, 11 herbs and spices, has become so famous that it functions like a slogan. You do not know what the 11 are. That is the entire point. The not knowing is the product, and people cannot resist trying to crack it. Over the decades, amateur cooks, journalists, and self-appointed food detectives have claimed to reverse engineer the blend, publishing lists that supposedly reveal the truth. Some of these attempts are surprisingly plausible. A relative of Sanders was even reported to have turned up a handwritten list in an old family scrapbook that may or may not have been the genuine article. The company naturally neither confirmed nor denied, because confirming or denying would ruin the magic, and the magic is worth more than any single batch of chicken. There is something almost philosophical in it. The value here is not really in the spices, which are, at the end of the day, things you can buy in any grocery store. The value is in the belief that this particular combination is uniquely, irreplaceably special. It is faith, sold by the bucket. As long as everyone agrees the secret is worth protecting, the secret stays valuable, whether or not it would actually taste any different from a decent homemade approximation. Sanders built that faith. He built the recipe, the method, the persona, and the mystique, brick by careful brick, over a lifetime of failure and reinvention, and then he sold it. Which is where the story takes its most bitter and human turn, because the moment the empire slipped out of his hands, the old man discovered he could not stand what it became. Here is the part they leave out of the commercials. Harlan Sanders sold the company, and then he absolutely hated what happened to it. Freed from control but kept on as the smiling mascot, the old man watched new owners change his beloved recipes to cut costs, and he did not suffer in silence. He publicly trashed the gravy, describing it in terms usually reserved for wallpaper paste and household glue. He complained the chicken had been ruined. The company he had founded ended up in a legal fight with the very man whose face was on every bucket, because the mascot would not stop insulting the food. Imagine your grandfather being the official symbol of a restaurant and also its loudest, angriest critic. That was the Colonel, right to the end. This sale itself made perfect sense on paper. Sanders was getting older. The chain had grown faster than one aging man could manage, and a group of investors offered him a fortune to take it off his hands. He accepted, walking away with a large sum, a lifetime salary, and a role as the company's goodwill ambassador and public face. On paper, a happy ending. A poor, luckless man who finally struck gold in his twilight years and could relax at last. Except Harlan Sanders had never in his life known how to relax, and he most certainly did not know how to watch other people run the thing he had bled for. He had spent decades perfecting his chicken and his gravy by hand, tasting, adjusting, obsessing. He regarded the food the way a painter regards a canvas, and the new owners, quite reasonably from a business standpoint, regarded it the way owners regard a product. They wanted it cheaper to make, faster to produce, and consistent across thousands of locations. Something had to give, and what gave was, in the Colonel's furious opinion, the soul of the food. The gravy became his particular battlefield. To Sanders, the gravy was not a side item. It was, he insisted, one of the finest things about the entire meal, a recipe he had laboured over endlessly. When he tasted what the company was serving under his name, he was appalled, and he said so, loudly, publicly, and repeatedly, comparing it to paste and glue and sludge in language that no marketing department on earth would have approved. He did not phrase his criticism gently. He was a man in his 80s telling the world that the company bearing his face and his title was serving garbage. You can only imagine the awkwardness inside the boardroom. Their entire brand was built on a beloved founder, and that beloved founder kept giving interviews trashing their food. It is the corporate equivalent of hiring a celebrity to endorse your product and then having them go on television to warn people away from it. Eventually the friction spilled into an actual legal dispute, a tangle over his name, his image, and how much freedom he had to criticize the company that both employed him and owned the rights to his own likeness. There is something deeply poignant underneath the comedy of it. Sanders had spent his whole hard life trying to build one thing that was truly his, one thing done right, and the moment it became successful enough to matter, it stopped being his at all. The white suit remained, the smile remained, the image of the warm old gentleman remained, and remains to this day. But the man inside that image spent his final years as a stranger to his own creation, complaining bitterly about a kingdom that no longer answered to its king. He was not the only founder whose legacy would drift far from his intentions. But to understand how the whole industry earned the trust it would later spend so freely, we have to go back to a time when Americans were genuinely afraid to eat a hamburger at all. To understand why any of this exists, we have to go back further, to a time when Americans were genuinely terrified of the hamburger. In the early 1900s, a writer named Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle, exposing the horrifying filth of the meatpacking industry, and it left the public convinced that ground beef was basically a poison patty. Enter White Castle in 1921, which set out to sell burgers to people who were genuinely afraid of them. Their solution was aggressive cleanliness. Gleaming white buildings, stainless steel, visible kitchens, spotless counters, all designed to scream this meat will not kill you. They practically dared you to watch them cook. It was a marketing campaign built entirely on overcoming disgust, and it is the reason the modern burger stand exists at all. Sinclair had not set out to ruin the hamburger. He had written The Jungle, hoping to expose the brutal conditions endured by immigrant workers in the great meatpacking plants. But the passages that seized the public by the throat were the ones describing the meat itself. Diseased animals processed into food, filth swept into the grinders, rats, and worse, ending up in the product. Sinclair famously said he had aimed at the nation's heart and hit it in the stomach instead. The book triggered genuine reform and new food safety laws, but it also left a lasting scar on the reputation of ground beef. For years afterward, chopped meat carried a whiff of suspicion, whole cuts you could inspect with your own eyes. But ground beef was a mystery, a mush of unknown parts that could be hiding anything, and the public had just been handed vivid, nauseating descriptions of exactly what that anything might be. Serving a hamburger to a cautious customer in that era was a genuine uphill battle. You were not just selling food, you were selling reassurance. White Castle understood this perfectly, and its answer was to weaponize cleanliness. Everything about the design was engineered to fight the ghost of Sinclair's book. The very name evoked purity and strength, a castle, white as fresh snow, standing sturdy and clean. The buildings were built with white enamelled exteriors and shining stainless steel interiors, materials chosen specifically because they looked and stayed spotless. There was nowhere for grime to hide, and crucially, they let you watch. The kitchens were open and visible, inviting the customer to see the meat being handled and cooked right in front of them. This was radical. It was the opposite of the hidden, secretive slaughterhouses that had horrified the nation. It said, in effect, we have nothing to hide. Come and look. The company even ran promotions emphasizing hygiene, and reportedly went to lengths to publicly demonstrate the quality and safety of its beef, essentially staging a decades-long argument that the humble hamburger was safe, respectable, and worthy of your trust. It worked. Slowly, the hamburger was rehabilitated from suspect mystery meat into an American staple. White Castle proved that the key to selling a food people feared was not to hide the process, but to flaunt it, to make cleanliness itself the entire brand. Every gleaming fast food kitchen you've ever seen, every visible grill and open service counter, is a distant descendant of that original idea. The industry learned early that appearance and reassurance could be just as important as flavour. That lesson would echo through everything that followed. If you can control how people feel about your food, you can sell them almost anything. And nobody would take that principle further or aim it at a more impressionable audience than the empire that decided the perfect salesman for a hamburger was a clown. Somewhere along the way, someone in a boardroom decided that what sold hamburgers to children was a clown, and the strange thing is that they were completely right. The earliest version of the famous fast food clown was played on local television by a weatherman of all people, before the character was polished, redesigned, and unleashed nationally. Soon there was an entire imaginary universe built around him, a whole kingdom of characters designed to live rent-free in the mind of every kid in America. It worked with terrifying efficiency. A generation grew up recognizing the clown before they could read. Nobody stopped to ask whether children should be emotionally attached to a corporate mascot. Because he was cheerful, he was everywhere, and he was very, very good for business. The clown's beginnings were surprisingly humble and local. In the early days before national fame, a version of the character appeared in regional television spots, and the man who first brought him to life was a local television personality better known for forecasting the weather. It was a modest, almost accidental birth for what would become one of the most recognized fictional figures on the planet. The company saw the reaction the character got from children and understood instantly what it had stumbled onto. Children did not care about real estate strategies or franchise economics. Children cared about the clown. So the character was taken seriously, reworked, and refined into a polished national figure, given a consistent look and personality, and pushed relentlessly into the public eye. And then the company did something clever and slightly eerie. It did not stop at one character. It built an entire fictional world around him, a whole cast of colourful friends and gently menacing villains, each one designed to be memorable and merchandisable. A purple creature, a burglar themed around stealing hamburgers, a collection of characters who lived in a bright, cheerful imaginary land that existed for one reason and one reason only: to make children associate joy, fun, and friendship with a specific place to buy food. Consider how effective that is as a strategy. Adults are skeptical. Adults read prices and compare value and grumble about nutrition. But a small child does not evaluate a restaurant. A small child forms an attachment, and attachments formed young are astonishingly durable. Win a 5-year-old with a friendly clown and a fantastical world, and you may well have won a customer who feels a warm flicker of nostalgia every time they see that face for the next 70 years. The clown was not selling a burger. The clown was installing a lifelong emotional bond, one birthday party and one cartoon at a time. There is a reason this approach spread across the industry like wildfire. It simply worked better than anything aimed at adults. Mascots, characters, colours, jingles, all of it bypassed the skeptical adult brain and went straight for the child, and the child did the rest, tugging on sleeves in the back seat, pointing at the glowing sign, demanding the place with the clown. Parents surrendered by the millions. It is worth pausing, as you lie there in the dark, to appreciate how quietly bold this was. An entire multi-billion-dollar industry decided that its most valuable audience was people who could not yet count their own money, and it built cheerful, unforgettable fantasy worlds specifically to capture their loyalty before they were old enough to question any of it. The clown was warm, the clown was fun. The clown was also one of the most calculated pieces of persuasion ever pointed at a human being, and it was pointed directly at kids. And that cheerful imaginary kingdom, for all its innocent colour, was about to lead the company straight into a courtroom. That imaginary kingdom of characters landed the company in real trouble. Two brothers named Sid and Marty Croft had created a beloved children's television show set in a fantastical land full of talking creatures and a big, friendly mayor. When the fast food chain rolled out its own suspiciously similar universe, complete with a suspiciously similar setting and characters, the Croft brothers noticed, and they sued, and they won. A court agreed that the Burger Kingdom had leaned a little too heavily on someone else's imagination. So the beloved, wholesome children's marketing world that sold billions of meals was, in the eyes of the law, partly built on borrowed magic. Even the fantasy had a lawsuit hiding underneath it. To understand why the Croft brothers were so upset, you have to understand what they had built. Their show was a genuine phenomenon of children's television, a bright, strange, psychedelic world populated by living creatures, a talking flute, and a warm, rotund mayor who presided over the whole enchanted land. It was inventive, it was distinctive, and it was theirs. They had poured real creative energy into designing that universe, and children adored it. Then the fast food company launched its own advertising world, and to the Croft brothers the resemblance was not subtle. A magical land, a cast of colourful creatures, a friendly, portly authority figure ruling over it all, whimsical settings that looked to their eyes an awful lot like the settings they had dreamed up. To make matters worse, the brothers claimed that some of the very people who had worked on their show had gone on to help create the competing ad campaign, which is the creative equivalent of your former chef opening a restaurant next door with a suspiciously familiar menu. So they took the giant to court, which was no small thing. On one side, two brothers who made children's television. On the other, one of the most powerful and well-funded corporations in the country. It had the makings of a hopeless mismatch, and yet the case went the brothers' way. A court found that the advertising world had improperly borrowed from their creation, that the total look and feel had been copied closely enough to cross a legal line. The company was ordered to pay. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. This was the wholesome stuff. This was the friendly, innocent, children-focused branding that was supposed to represent everything warm and trustworthy about the empire. The whole point of the fantasy kingdom was to project purity and joy, and it turned out that this purity and joy had, according to a court of law, been partly lifted from someone else's imagination. The magic castle had been built, at least in part, on borrowed bricks. It is a small, almost forgotten chapter, but it captures something essential about the industry. Behind every cheerful surface there tends to be a harder, more calculating machine at work, one that will reach for whatever creates the strongest reaction in the customer, even if that means reaching into someone else's storybook. The characters were not conjured from pure whimsy and a spirit of childlike fun. They were assembled by a marketing operation chasing a proven emotional response. And when the fastest way to that response happened to resemble a rival's beloved creation, well, that is what the courts were for. The company paid, adjusted, and rolled on, its cheerful kingdom barely dented in the public memory. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. It worked anyway. The lawsuit did nothing to loosen the grip these characters had on an entire generation of children. And that grip was the whole strategy, a strategy so effective and so deliberate that it deserves a closer look at exactly how it was aimed at the youngest, most defenceless customers of all. Let's talk about how they got the children, because it was not an accident. It was a strategy, carefully engineered and relentlessly executed. Playgrounds were added so the restaurant became a destination rather than a meal. Birthday parties were hosted on the premises so your happiest childhood memories were sponsored. Meals were designed around the emotional needs of a 5-year-old rather than the nutritional needs of a human. The logic was cold and simple. Win the child, and the child drags the parents through the door, and the child grows into an adult who feels a warm, nostalgic glow every time they see those arches. It is one of the most effective long-term marketing plans ever devised, and it was aimed squarely at people too young to tie their own shoes. The playground was a stroke of quiet genius. On the surface it looks like a gift, a kindness, a free bit of fun for the kids while the parents eat in peace. And it is fun, which is exactly why it works. A playground transforms the restaurant from a place you go when you are hungry into a place you go because you want to. A small local kingdom of slides and ball pits and climbing tubes that a child will beg to return to, whether or not anyone is hungry at all. The food becomes the admission ticket to the playground, rather than the playground being a bonus with the food. That is a complete inversion of how eating is supposed to work, and children never noticed the switch. Then came the birthday parties, and this is where the strategy reveals its long game. Think about what a birthday means to a small child. It is the most important, most emotionally charged day of the entire year, a day of joy and cake and friends and feeling like the center of the universe, and the company offered to host that day, to wrap that peak childhood happiness in its branding, its characters, its colors. A child who celebrates several birthdays there does not just remember good food. They fuse the brand with some of the warmest, most joyful memories of their entire early life. You cannot buy that kind of loyalty. You can only install it early and let it ripen for decades. Everything about the children's meal followed the same logic. The bright box, the prize inside, the characters printed on every surface. None of it was designed to nourish a growing body. It was designed to delight a small mind, to create a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness that the child would want again and again. And a happy child is a powerful economic engine, because a happy child applies relentless, tireless pressure on the two adults holding the money. Marketers even have a blunt term for this force. They talk about the pester factor, the sheer wearing down power of a child who wants something and will not stop asking. Advertising aimed at children is not really trying to persuade the child who has no wallet. It is arming the child to persuade the parent who does. The 5-year-old becomes an unpaid, extremely motivated salesperson working inside your own home, from the back seat of your own car, and no parent alive has fully resisted that campaign forever. The results speak for themselves. Generations grew up with these brands woven into the fabric of their happiest early memories and carried that warmth into adulthood, passing it down to children of their own, who got their own playgrounds and their own birthday parties and their own lifelong glow. The loyalty compounds across generations like interest in a very strange bank. And at the center of it all sat one small, brilliant, endlessly imitated object. Not the burger, the toy. The masterpiece of that strategy came in a small cardboard box with a handle. The famous kids' meal did not become a cultural juggernaut because of the food inside it. It became one because of the toy. Companies learned that a cheap plastic figurine, especially one tied to a hit movie, could drive more sales than any burger ever could. Suddenly parents were buying meals not to feed their children but to complete a collection, because there were several toys and your child needed all of them, or the world would apparently end. The food was the delivery vehicle, the toy was the product, and the genius of it was that the meal itself became almost beside the point, which, if you have ever seen a half-eaten kids' meal abandoned beside a fully claimed toy, you already knew. The mechanics of this are almost too clever. A single toy is nice, but a set of toys, released a few at a time with a new one appearing every week or so, turns a simple meal into a compulsion. Now the child does not want a meal. The child wants the complete collection, and completing the collection requires returning again and again and again, each visit yielding one more small plastic treasure and one more reason to come back. It is the same psychological hook that powers trading cards and collectible games, deployed against people young enough to still believe in the tooth fairy. The real detonation came when the meals were tied to blockbuster films. A hugely popular movie hits theatres, the child is already obsessed, and now the restaurant offers a toy of that exact beloved character, available only for a limited time, only with the meal. The demand this created could be staggering. Certain movie tie-in promotions became genuine cultural events, with families making special trips, toys becoming sought-after items, and lines forming for what was, at the end of the day, a small figurine bundled with a hamburger. And here is the quiet punchline that any parent will recognise. The food frequently went uneaten. Watch a child receive one of these meals and you will see the box torn open, the toy seized with total single-minded focus, and the actual food regarded as an afterthought, picked at, ignored, abandoned. The company had achieved something remarkable. It had created a food product whose food component was functionally optional. The child was there for the plastic. The nutrition was a formality, and often not even that. This tells you everything about the priorities at work. An enormous amount of creative and commercial energy went into the toy, the tie-in deals, the collectability, the packaging, the characters. The meal itself was the stable, cheap, reliable thing bolted onto the exciting part. In a sense, these companies had drifted into a strange hybrid business, part restaurant, part toy distributor, and the toy side was often what actually moved the customers through the door. There is something both funny and a little melancholy about it. The whole apparatus of a children's meal, the box, the prize, the collection, the movie hero in your small hands, was engineered to manufacture a feeling of wanting. Not needing. Wanting. A pure, urgent, delighted craving in a small child for something that mattered enormously in the moment and would be forgotten in a drawer within weeks. But not every empire in this story leaned on clowns and toys and children. Some built their names on a very different promise, aimed at grown adults who liked to think they were too sensible for all that, and one of them made its fortune on a single unforgettable question about the size of a competitor's beef. Not every empire was born from a clown or a colonel. Some were born from a moustached man in a suit who genuinely seemed to like people. Dave Thomas built his chain around the idea that the burgers would be a little fresher, a little squarer, and served with a homey sincerity, and he put himself in the commercials as a kind of friendly national uncle. But the most famous moment in the brand's history was not even about their own food. It was an ad featuring an elderly woman glaring at a tiny competitor's patty and demanding to know the location of the beef. That single question became a national catchphrase, a punchline, and even a line in political debates. One little old lady and one small burger managed to define an entire decade of fast food marketing. Dave Thomas was, by the standards of this story, an unusually likeable founder. He was not a ruthless landlord in disguise, and he was not a brawling roadside gunfighter. He was a rounder, warmer figure who had worked in the restaurant business for years, including a stint helping turn around struggling chicken franchises, before starting his own hamburger chain and naming it after his daughter. When he eventually became the face of his own commercials, he came across as exactly what he appeared to be. A genuine, slightly awkward, sincerely enthusiastic man who really did seem to believe in his square burgers. The square burger, by the way, was itself a bit of marketing cleverness dressed up as honesty. The patties were cut square so that they stuck out past the round bun, a visual trick that made them look bigger, and according to the pitch, signalled that the beef was not hiding. The corners were the point. They said, quite literally, "Look how much beef there is, we cannot even fit it on the bun." It was a small, smart piece of theatre built into the shape of the food itself. But all of that was overshadowed by one advertisement that became bigger than the brand. The premise was simple. Three elderly women examine a comically enormous competitor's bun, only to discover a hilariously tiny patty buried inside it. And one of them, with magnificent, withering indignation, demands to know where the beef is. That was it. That was the whole idea. And it detonated across the culture like nothing the industry had seen. The phrase escaped the commercial and took on a life entirely its own. People said it constantly about everything. It became shorthand for any situation where the packaging promised more than the substance delivered. It showed up on merchandise. It showed up in ordinary conversation. It even made its way into serious political discourse, memorably deployed during a presidential campaign debate to accuse an opponent of having flashy slogans with no real ideas underneath. A hamburger commercial had given the nation a permanent phrase for the gap between hype and reality. What makes it so perfect for our purposes is that the most successful moment in this empire's history was, at its core, an attack on the honesty of a rival's food. The whole joke depended on the shared, unspoken understanding that fast food burgers were often smaller and sadder than their advertising suggested. The ad worked precisely because everyone already suspected they were being shortchanged, and here was a company gleefully saying it out loud, about the other guy. It was truth in advertising, aimed like a weapon, and that theme, the endless suspicion about what is really inside the food, would come back again and again for these companies, sometimes as a clever ad, and sometimes as a genuine crisis, like the day a customer claimed to bite down on something in her chili that no one should ever find in their dinner. Then came the day a customer claimed to find a human finger in her bowl of chili, and the entire company nearly went up in flames. News spread instantly, sales collapsed, and franchises bled money as horrified customers swore off the chain. There was only one small problem with the story. It was completely fake. The woman had planted the finger herself as part of a scheme to extract a payout, and the finger, it turned out, belonged to an acquaintance who had lost it in an industrial accident. The hoax unravelled, she was sent to prison, and the company was vindicated, but not before the very idea of a finger in the food had cost them a staggering amount of money and a great deal of dignity. The story broke like a thunderclap. A woman dining at one of the chain's locations claimed that as she ate her chili, she bit into something firm and unfamiliar, and that upon inspection it turned out to be a human fingertip. It is difficult to imagine a more instantly viral piece of bad news for a restaurant. There is nothing abstract about it, nothing that requires explanation or context. A finger in the chili. The image lodges itself in the brain and refuses to leave, and it makes the stomach turn on contact. The public reaction was immediate and merciless. People stopped ordering the chili, then people stopped ordering anything. The disgust was so powerful that it spread from that one bowl to the entire brand, and sales at the chain's restaurants plunged. Franchise owners, ordinary people who had invested their livelihoods, watched their businesses hemorrhage money through no fault of their own, all because of one horrifying claim that everyone had heard and no one could unhear. But as investigators dug in, the story began to fall apart. The finger did not show signs of having been cooked in hot chili. That was a crucial detail. If it had truly been simmering in the pot, it would have looked very different. This finger appeared to have been added afterward, which pointed away from a kitchen accident and toward something far more deliberate. Suspicion turned toward the woman who had made the claim, and it emerged that she had a history of filing lawsuits. This was not, it seemed, her first attempt to turn a mishap into a payout. The truth, when it finally came out, was almost too grim to be funny. The fingertip had not come from any kitchen. It had belonged to an acquaintance of the woman's husband, a man who had genuinely lost part of his finger in a workplace accident, and had, astonishingly, given the severed piece away. The couple had then planted it in the chili, hoping to extract a large settlement from a company desperate to avoid scandal. It was a scheme built on the assumption that the corporation would simply pay to make the horror story disappear. Instead, the company fought. The investigation exposed the plot, and the woman and her husband were convicted and sent to prison. Justice of a strange and macabre sort was served. The chili was cleared. The finger was accounted for. The brand was vindicated. And yet the vindication came at enormous cost. The damage had already been done in those first days when the story was everywhere and the truth was nowhere. Millions in lost sales, franchises pushed to the brink, a brand name suddenly, indelibly linked in the public mind with a severed finger. You can win the case and still lose an incalculable amount, because in the fast food business, perception moves at the speed of gossip and truth arrives long after everyone has already stopped eating. That vulnerability, the terror of a single viral accusation, runs through the whole industry, and it is not always a hoax. Sometimes the question of what is really in the food comes not from a con artist, but from a courtroom. Down the road, another empire was fighting a very different battle over meat, this time in a courtroom. A lawsuit alleged that the seasoned beef in a certain chain's tacos was not really beef at all, claiming the mixture contained a surprisingly small percentage of actual meat and a long list of fillers, binders, and additives with names that sound more like a chemistry exam than a lunch. The company fought back loudly, insisting their beef was overwhelmingly beef with seasonings, and the lawsuit was eventually withdrawn. But the damage lingered, because the question had already been asked out loud, and once someone makes you read the ingredient list of a taco, you can never fully unread it. The accusation struck at the most basic promise a food can make. When you order a beef taco, you're trusting that the primary thing inside it is, in fact, beef. The lawsuit challenged that trust directly, alleging that the seasoned filling contained a startlingly low proportion of actual meat, with the remainder made up of extenders, binders, water, and various seasoning agents. The suit even argued that the product should not legally be called beef at all, that it failed to meet the standard a reasonable person would expect from that word. The claimed ingredient list read like something out of a laboratory. Beyond the meat, there were binding agents to hold the mixture together, additives to preserve texture, ingredients with long technical names whose purpose the average customer could not begin to guess. To someone accustomed to thinking of a taco as meat and spices, the picture painted was jarring, an image of a carefully engineered food-adjacent paste rather than seasoned ground beef. The company did not take this quietly. It understood that in this business, an accusation about the integrity of your core product is an existential threat, and it responded with an aggressive public defense. It insisted, loudly and repeatedly, that its seasoned beef was overwhelmingly real beef, with the rest made up of ordinary seasonings, water, and standard ingredients used to hold and flavour the mixture. The same sorts of things a person might use cooking at home. It ran advertisements essentially inviting customers to examine the ingredients for themselves, treating transparency as a shield. The message was clear. We have nothing to hide, and the lawsuit is wrong. In the end, the lawsuit was withdrawn. The company declared victory, framing the outcome as complete vindication and demanding, in its own advertising, an apology for the damage the accusation had caused. On paper, the empire won. The claim was dropped. The beef was defended. The crisis passed. But this is the recurring lesson of these food fights, and it is worth remembering as you drift towards sleep. Winning the legal battle does not undo the question. The lawsuit forced millions of people to stop and actually think about what might be inside their favourite quick meal, to picture the fillers and the binders and the long chemical names, to read, perhaps for the first time, the fine print of something they had happily eaten 100 times without a second thought. And that thought does not fully go away. The company can prove its beef is beef and still lose something because it has made you look behind the curtain, and behind the curtain there is always a little more machinery than you wanted to see. The pattern holds no matter what is being questioned. Sometimes it is the meat, sometimes it is the mascot, and sometimes, absurdly, it is a matter of a single missing inch of bread. Sometimes the scandal is simply a matter of measurement. One sandwich empire built its entire identity around a sandwich named for its length, promising a full 12 inches of value. Then a customer did the unthinkable. He laid a tape measure across his sandwich, took a photo, and discovered it came up short, closer to 11 inches. The photo spread, outrage followed, and the company found itself in an actual legal fight over inches of bread. The whole affair ended with settlements and promises to standardize sandwich length, which meant that grown adults with law degrees spent real time and real money arguing about how long a sandwich is legally required to be. History rarely gets more gloriously ridiculous than that. The brilliance of the sandwich's branding was that it put a number right in the name. A number is a promise. It is specific, measurable, and crucially checkable. Most food marketing floats along on vague adjectives like fresh and delicious and hearty, words that mean nothing and can be proven wrong by no one. But a sandwich named for a precise length had made a claim that any customer with a ruler could test. For years nobody bothered. Then one person did, and the whole thing came apart. The customer photographed his sandwich next to a tape measure, and the picture told a simple, damning story. The bread fell short of the promised length, landing closer to 11 inches than 12. He posted it, and the internet did what the internet does. The image raced around the world. Suddenly, people everywhere were pulling out rulers, measuring their own sandwiches and posting their own results, and a surprising number of them came up short too. A global brand was being audited, one lunch at a time, by an army of amateurs with measuring tape. What followed was, when you step back, genuinely absurd. Lawsuits were filed. The matter became a real legal proceeding, with lawyers, arguments, and negotiations, all centered on the profound question of whether a sandwich sold as a certain length was obligated to actually be that length. Serious legal professionals, people who had studied for years and passed difficult examinations, found themselves debating the acceptable dimensions of bread. Somewhere, a judge had to take this seriously. Somewhere, documents were filed that used the word footlong in a legal context. The company's defense wandered into territory that was almost philosophical. There were arguments about how bread is a natural product that varies, how dough can bake up slightly differently each time, how the name was meant to describe a general size rather than a guaranteed exact measurement. In other words, the empire found itself in the strange position of arguing that its own headline promise was not really a precise promise at all, which is a difficult message to deliver without quietly undermining the very thing that made the sandwich famous. Eventually the matter was resolved through settlement, with the company agreeing to take steps to ensure its sandwiches would consistently meet the promised length going forward. Practically speaking, they promised to make the bread the size they had always said it was. The lawyers were paid. The customers who sued received relatively little, and the whole spectacle passed into history as a small, perfect monument to the modern age, a time when a corporation could be dragged into court over a missing inch of bread, and everyone involved had to pretend it was a matter of grave importance. It is a reminder that in the fast food world, every promise is a potential liability, no matter how small. But the biggest scandal of all was not about an inch, or a finger, or the contents of a taco. It was about a beloved national game, rigged from the inside for over a decade, and the man who quietly stole the winning tickets. For years, one chain ran a wildly popular promotional game modelled on a famous board game, dangling million-dollar prizes and instant cash on peel-off tickets, and for years, nearly every big winner was secretly a fraud. The man in charge of security for printing the game pieces, the one person specifically hired to keep it honest, was quietly stealing the winning tickets. He built a sprawling network of friends, family, and recruited strangers who would claim the prizes and kick money back to him. For over a decade, the biggest winners of a beloved national contest were part of a criminal ring. Millions of dollars in prizes that were supposed to feel like magic were, in fact, a very carefully organised heist hiding behind a cartoon mascot. The game was a sensation. Customers peeled little tickets off their food packaging, matching them to a board like the classic property trading game, chasing small instant wins and above all the dream of the rare, life-changing top prizes. It drove enormous sales because the promise was irresistible. Every order came with a lottery ticket, and every ticket carried the faint, glorious possibility that this could be the one that made you a millionaire. It was hope, deep-fried and served with a side of fries. The trouble was that the hope was a lie, at least at the top. The company had, quite responsibly, hired an outside security firm to oversee the printing and distribution of the winning game pieces to make sure no one could tamper with them. The most valuable tickets were handled with strict procedures, transported securely, protected at every step, and the man responsible for that security, the very person trusted above all others to guarantee the game was fair, was the one stealing the winning pieces. He exploited his position with patient, methodical corruption. Whenever a high-value winning ticket passed through his hands, he could quietly divert it. But a stolen winning ticket is useless if you cannot cash it without raising suspicion, so he built a network. He recruited people, family, friends, acquaintances, and eventually strangers connected through intermediaries who would pose as ordinary lucky winners. They would step forward, claim the enormous prizes with convincing stories, collect the money, and funnel a large share back to the man who had handed them the ticket. For over a decade this went on. The great publicised top prizes of a beloved national game, the winners smiling for cameras, the feel-good stories of ordinary people striking it rich, were substantially a fraud. The genuine customer, peeling their ticket with real hope, was chasing prizes that had in many cases already been stolen before the game even began. The dream was real to them. The odds were a joke. The scheme grew sprawling and complex, with winners spread across the country to avoid the obvious red flag of everyone knowing each other. It was, in its own grubby way, an impressive piece of organisation, but schemes like this rarely end quietly. A tip eventually reached federal investigators, who unravelled the network, traced the suspiciously connected winners, and exposed the whole operation. The mastermind and many of his recruited winners faced criminal charges, and the man at the centre went to prison. The company itself was a victim here, defrauded by the very person it had trusted to keep things clean, and it scrambled to make things right, even running new giveaways to restore faith. But the story lingers as something almost mythic, the perfect fast food scandal, a cartoon board game, a promise of magic, a nation of hopeful customers, and hidden underneath it all, a decade-long criminal conspiracy run by the guy hired to guard the prizes. The house was not just winning. The house was being robbed from the inside, and the customers never had a chance. If that was corruption hidden inside the marketing, the next crisis came from the food itself, when one man decided to eat nothing else for a month and let the world watch what happened. Then came the era of bigger is better, when a single word could turn a normal meal into a mountain of fries and a bucket of soda for barely any extra cost. Portions swelled to sizes that would have baffled the original founders. But the tide turned when a filmmaker decided to eat nothing but one chain's food for an entire month, on camera, always saying yes when offered the largest size, and documenting exactly what it did to his body. The results were alarming enough to become a cultural moment, and shortly afterward the largest option quietly vanished from the menu, with the company insisting the timing was pure coincidence. Nobody believed the timing was pure coincidence. The logic of the giant portion was seductive, and it was aimed at a very human weakness. For just a few pennies more you could upgrade your fries and your drink to enormous sizes. The math felt like a bargain. Look how much more food you get for such a tiny extra cost. What the math conveniently ignored was that nobody actually needed the larger amount, and that the true cost was not measured in coins, but in the slow, cumulative effect of eating far more than a body was ever designed to handle. The bargain was on the receipt. The bill came due elsewhere. For a while this approach ruled. Portions crept ever upward across the industry. Sodas ballooned into vessels the size of small buckets, and the idea of a modest meal began to seem almost quaint. The original founders, who had sold small, simple burgers to families in an earlier era, would scarcely have recognized the towering quantities being pushed across the counter. Then a filmmaker had a deceptively simple idea. He would turn himself into the experiment. For one full month, he would eat only food from a single major chain, 3 meals a day, and whenever an employee offered to increase him to the largest size, he would accept. He would submit to regular medical checkups throughout, documenting the effect on his weight, his organs, his energy, and his mood, and he would put all of it on film for the world to see. The results were genuinely alarming. Over the month, his weight climbed sharply, his health markers deteriorated, his doctors grew visibly concerned, and he described feeling physically and mentally worse in ways that startled even him. Whatever quibbles anyone might raise about the extremity of the experiment, the raw footage was hard to argue with. Here was a person visibly declining, in real time, on a diet of nothing but the food millions of people ate regularly, if not quite so exclusively. The film became a phenomenon, sparking national conversation about portion sizes, nutrition, and the responsibility of the company serving this food. It landed at a moment when the public was already growing uneasy about the health effects of the modern diet, and it gave that unease a vivid, unforgettable face. Not long after, the largest size option quietly disappeared from the chain's menu. The company was careful to insist that this had nothing whatsoever to do with the film, that it was simply a routine menu simplification, a matter of streamlining choices for customers. It was, they maintained, pure coincidence that the enormous portion vanished right as a hit documentary was showing the nation exactly what enormous portions could do. Nobody was fooled, and that in itself marked a shift. For the first time, the sheer size of the food had become a liability rather than a selling point. The empire had spent years teaching people to want more, and now suddenly more had become something to apologize for. It was a rare public retreat, and it hinted at a deeper truth these companies would very much prefer you not dwell on. The craving you feel for their food is not an accident of taste. It is the product of careful, deliberate science. Let's talk about why you want it even when you know better, because that is not an accident either. Food scientists spend real careers in real laboratories chasing the precise balance of salt, fat and sugar that lights up the reward centers of the human brain. There is even a concept describing the perfect point at which a food is maximally craveable without ever becoming quite satisfying, so that you always feel like you could go for a little more. Textures are tuned, aromas are engineered, everything is designed so that your appetite rights checks your judgment did not authorize. That midnight urge you cannot explain is not a personal weakness. It is the intended outcome of a great deal of expensive, deliberate research aimed directly at your instincts. Start with the three great pillars: salt, fat, and sugar. Each one hits the human brain like a small reward, a leftover instinct from an ancient past when these things were rare and precious and worth seeking out. In a world of scarcity, a craving for fat and sugar and salt kept your distant ancestors alive. But that instinct did not vanish when food became abundant. It simply became a vulnerability, a door left unlocked in the back of the mind, and modern food science learned exactly how to walk through it. The scientists who develop these products are not casually tossing ingredients together. They are running careful tests, adjusting formulations, measuring responses, chasing the exact combination that produces the strongest pull. There is a concept sometimes described as the point of maximum pleasure, the precise level of sweetness or richness that delivers the greatest reward. Push past it, and the food becomes cloying. Too much, and the appetite recoils. Land exactly on it, and the food feels irresistible. Companies spend real money hunting for that sweet spot, quite literally. But there is a subtler trick underneath, and it is almost sinister in its cleverness. The goal is often not to fully satisfy you. A food that truly fills you and puts an end to your hunger has, from a sales perspective, failed, because a satisfied customer stops eating and stops buying. The ideal is a food that delivers intense pleasure with each bite, yet never quite closes the loop, never quite says enough, so that you keep reaching for more, chasing a satisfaction that stays permanently just out of reach. That is why you can finish an enormous portion and still feel, strangely, like you could keep going. Texture is engineered too. Foods are designed to feel a certain way in the mouth, to have the right crunch, the right melt, the right resistance, because texture is a huge part of pleasure and craving. Some products are built to almost dissolve, giving the sensation of eating without the fullness that would normally follow, tricking the body into consuming far more than it registers. Aroma is engineered as well, because so much of taste is actually smell, and the right scent can trigger hunger before you've taken a single bite. Put it all together and you have a product that is not really food in the simple, old-fashioned sense. It is a carefully optimized delivery system for pleasure, tuned by specialists to bypass your rational mind and speak directly to the oldest, most instinctive parts of your brain. The cravings you feel are not a flaw in your character. They're a feature of the product, working exactly as designed. So the next time you find yourself, late at night, gripped by an inexplicable urge for something salty and rich, understand what is actually happening. You're not weak. You're up against teams of scientists, decades of research, and instincts older than civilization itself, all quietly conspiring in a paper bag. And the ingredients that make it possible are stranger and longer than you might ever guess. Somewhere in the ingredient list lurks a cast of characters you would never invite to dinner. Anti-foaming agents to keep the frying oil from bubbling over. Emulsifiers to keep things from separating. Preservatives, stabilizers, dough conditioners, and colouring agents with names so long they wrap onto a second line. Most of these are perfectly legal and generally considered safe in small amounts, which is a sentence that has never once made anyone feel better. The point is not that any single additive will harm you. The point is that a simple-looking item, a bun, a nugget, a milkshake, is often a small marvel of industrial chemistry, assembled to survive shipping, storage, and heat lamps, and to look exactly the same in every restaurant on Earth. Consider the anti-foaming agent, because it is a perfect little window into how this all works. When you fry food in enormous vats of oil all day long, The oil tends to foam and bubble in ways that are messy and inefficient, so a compound is added to keep it calm. This same class of compound shows up in some very unglamorous places outside the kitchen, which is the sort of fact that circulates endlessly and horrifies people. In reality, it is used in tiny quantities and considered safe, but the mental image of it does the damage. Once you know it is in there, the fries taste faintly of a chemistry lab, whether or not they actually do. Then there are the emulsifiers, the quiet diplomats of processed food. Their job is to force together things that naturally refuse to mix, like oil and water, and hold them in a smooth, stable truce. Without them, many products would separate on the shelf into unappetizing layers. With them, everything stays creamy, uniform, and appealing for far longer than nature would ever allow. They are the reason a sauce looks the same on the first day and the 40th. Preservatives extend that unnatural longevity even further, holding off the mould and rot that would claim any honest, simple food within days. Stabilizers keep textures from collapsing. Dough conditioners make bread softer and more consistent and cheaper to produce at scale. Colouring agents ensure that the food is the exact shade the customer expects, because people eat with their eyes first and will reject a perfectly good item that looks even slightly wrong. Each of these serves a real purpose in the strange challenge of making millions of identical meals across thousands of locations, and that is really the heart of it. None of this exists because the food tastes better as a result. It exists to solve the logistical nightmare of an empire, the problem of producing something that can be frozen, shipped across a continent, stored for weeks, reheated by a teenager, and still arrive looking and tasting precisely like it did everywhere else. Consistency at that scale is not natural. Nature is messy and variable and prone to spoilage. To defeat nature, you need chemistry and lots of it. So the humble bun in your hand is not really so humble. It may contain a longer list of ingredients than a home baker would use in a year, each one added for a specific engineering reason, none of which have anything to do with your dinner tasting good. It is a product of factories and formulas, designed to be identical and immortal in ways that real bread never is. Which raises an uncomfortable question about all this preservation and stabilization and engineering. If the food is built to resist spoiling, to survive shipping and storage and time itself, what happens if you simply leave it out and wait? The answer, as many curious people have discovered, is deeply unsettling. Few phrases have ever damaged an industry faster than a nickname for a beef product that was never meant to be famous. The industry called it lean, finely textured beef, a filler made from processed trimmings treated to make them safe and stretch the meat supply further. Then a news report gave it a far catchier name involving the word pink, and the public recoiled instantly. It did not matter that regulators considered it safe. The mental image alone was enough. Sales cratered, plants closed, and an entire product built to reduce waste and lower prices became a national punchline overnight. It was a brutal lesson in the power of branding. You can survive a strange ingredient. You cannot survive a strange ingredient with a memorable and deeply unappetizing nickname. The product had a genuinely practical origin. When beef is butchered, there are always trimmings left over, small bits of meat clinging to fat and other portions that are perfectly edible, but difficult to recover efficiently. Rather than waste them, the industry developed a process to separate the lean meat from the fat, spinning and processing the trimmings to salvage the usable protein. The result was a lean, pale, paste-like beef product that could be blended into ground beef to increase the yield and lower the cost. In a world worried about food waste and rising prices, this was, on its face, a reasonable idea. There was, however, one part of the process that made people deeply uneasy once they learned of it. To ensure the recovered meat was safe from harmful bacteria, it was treated with a compound to kill pathogens. This treatment was approved and considered safe by food safety authorities, But the description of it, meat sprayed or treated with a chemical agent, was never going to sound appetizing no matter how you phrased it. It was the kind of detail that is fine in a technical document and catastrophic in a headline. For years, this filler was quietly blended into a large share of the ground beef sold in the country, in supermarkets and restaurants alike, and almost nobody knew or cared because almost nobody had heard of it. It did its job invisibly, stretching the supply and holding down costs. Ignorance, in this case, was genuinely blissful. Then the media discovered it and gave it that devastating nickname. 2 words, vivid and memorable and utterly revolting, that painted an instant picture of something pale and gloppy and wrong. The name spread across the country like a grease fire. Suddenly everyone was talking about it, sharing the image, expressing their horror. It didn't matter in the slightest that officials insisted the product was safe. Safety is an argument. Disgust is a reflex, and disgust wins. The reaction was swift and merciless. Consumers demanded the product be removed. Restaurants and grocery chains rushed to announce they would no longer use it, desperate to distance themselves from the phrase. Demand for the filler collapsed almost overnight. Production plants that made it were forced to shut down, and workers lost their jobs. An entire product line built over years to solve a real problem was wiped out in a matter of weeks by nothing more than a nickname. The company that made it even fought back in court over the damage it said the coverage had caused, a long and bitter dispute over how the product had been portrayed, but the damage was done. The lesson for the whole industry was stark and a little frightening. The reality of an ingredient matters far less than the story people tell about it. A safe product with a horrifying name is doomed, and a strange product with a friendly name can sail along for decades. Perception is the only thing that was ever really on the menu. Here is an experiment people keep repeating in their own kitchens, usually to their horror. They buy a fast food burger, set it on a shelf and simply wait. Days pass, weeks pass, months pass, and the burger unnervingly refuses to rot. The bun does not mould, the patty does not decay, and the whole thing slowly petrifies into a strange little fossil of a lunch. The unsettling truth is less supernatural than it looks. These burgers are small, thin, and cooked to be quite dry, and mould and bacteria need moisture to do their grim work. With so little water left, there is simply nothing for decay to feed on. It is not embalmed, it is just dehydrated, which is somehow only slightly more comforting than the alternative. The images are genuinely eerie, and they have circulated for years. People photograph a burger on the day of purchase, then again after months, sometimes after years, and the 2 pictures look nearly identical. The bun sits there, pale and intact. The patty is a little shriveled, a little darker, but recognisably a patty. No fuzz of mould, no slime, no collapse into the usual horror show that any normal food becomes when abandoned. It looks less like food that has aged and more like food that has been paused, frozen in time by some invisible force. The natural reaction is alarm. Surely a food that will not rot is unnatural, pumped so full of preservatives and chemicals that even bacteria will not touch it. It feels like proof that the stuff is barely food at all, that it is some indestructible synthetic object merely shaped like a meal, and it makes a powerful, memorable point, which is why the images keep spreading. There is something primal and unsettling about food that refuses to decay, because everything we understand about real food tells us it should. But the actual explanation is more mundane, if not much more reassuring. Rot requires moisture. The mould and bacteria that break food down need water to live and multiply. A thin, fast food patty cooked on a hot grill loses a great deal of its moisture in the process, and the small size means it dries out quickly once left in the open air. The bun, likewise, is thin and dries fast. Before decay can really get going, the whole thing simply dehydrates, hardening into a dry, mummified state where nothing can grow. It is the same principle that lets people preserve fruit or meat by drying it. Remove the water, and you remove the possibility of rot. Experiments have shown that when the same burgers are kept in more humid conditions, where moisture is retained, they will in fact mould like anything else. It is not the presence of some magical preservative keeping decay at bay, it is the absence of water. The burger is not immortal. It is just very, very dry. And yet knowing the science barely blunts the horror of the image. Understanding that a burger mummifies rather than rots does not make the sight of a years-old, perfectly recognisable sandwich any less disturbing. It still sits there on the shelf, quietly outlasting the natural order, a small monument to how far these foods have drifted from the moist, perishable, alive things our bodies evolved to eat. It is a reminder in fossil form of just how processed and engineered the modern meal has become. The people who make these burgers, of course, would rather you think about none of this. They would prefer you picture warm, friendly service and cheerful workers. But the people behind the counter carry a story of their own, one that gave a word to the modern dictionary. As the empires grew, so did their armies of workers, and a new word crept into the dictionary to describe the kind of job they offered. It came to mean low-paying, low prestige, and offering little room to climb, and the companies were, understandably, not thrilled to see it printed in an actual reference book. They pushed back hard, arguing that these jobs taught discipline, teamwork and responsibility, and that plenty of executives had started behind the counter. Both things were true at once. The work genuinely launched some careers and genuinely trapped many others, all while powering an industry worth uncountable billions. The person handing you your food was part of one of the largest and least celebrated workforces on the planet, and the debate over what they were owed never really cooled down. The word itself was a small linguistic bombshell, when a respected dictionary formally added a term describing a low-paying dead-end job in the service industry. Borrowing unmistakably from the name of the most famous chain of all, the companies were furious. It is one thing to be criticised in an article that will be forgotten. It is another to be enshrined in the permanent record of the language itself, defined for all time as the very symbol of unrewarding work. They protested loudly, demanded the definition be reconsidered, and argued it was insulting and inaccurate. The dictionary, for its part, largely stood its ground, noting that language reflects how people actually use words, and people were using that word exactly that way. The companies had a genuine case to make in their own defence, and it was not entirely hollow. These jobs really did serve as a first rung for enormous numbers of young people, teaching them how to show up on time, follow procedures, handle money, work as a team, and deal with difficult customers, skills that carry into any future career. And it was true that some people who started at the very bottom, taking orders and mopping floors, did rise through the ranks to management and beyond. The chains loved to tell those stories. The executive who began flipping burgers as a teenager, because they suggested the door to advancement was always open. But the fuller picture was harder. For every person who climbed, many more stayed near the bottom, working long, demanding shifts for wages that struggled to cover the basics of life. The work was physically tiring, the hours were often unpredictable, the pace was relentless, and the pay frequently left workers needing multiple jobs just to get by. The efficiency that made the food so cheap and fast rested in no small part on labour kept as inexpensive as possible. The very system the founders had engineered, the one that removed the need for skilled cooks and made every worker interchangeable, also made every worker easy to replace and hard to reward. This tension sat at the heart of the industry, and it never resolved. The chains employed vast numbers of people, more than almost any other kind of business, making them a genuine engine of first jobs and opportunity. And at the same time, they became a central symbol in the long, heated argument over fair wages, over whether the people making the food that fed the nation were being paid enough to live on. Protests, campaigns, and political fights over the minimum wage returned again and again to the counter, to the drive-through window, to the person handing over the bag. None of this ever appeared on the menu, of course. The struggle behind the counter was invisible to the customer, hidden behind the smile and the speed and the cheerful uniforms. But it was always there, the human cost of the machine, quietly powering an empire built on being fast and cheap. And speaking of things hidden from the customer, few myths have proven more stubborn than the legend of the food you're not supposed to know exists. You have heard the whispers, order this specific combination, say the right words, and unlock a hidden menu of items the general public is not supposed to know about. Part of this is real, since some regional favourites and off-menu tricks genuinely exist. But a great deal of the so-called secret menu is simply the internet inventing legends, then convincing confused teenage employees that they are supposed to know a recipe they have never heard of. It is a fascinating little piece of folklore, a modern myth built around cheeseburgers, spread by word of mouth and social media, mostly harmless, occasionally delicious, and endlessly frustrating to the poor soul at the register being asked to build a sandwich that exists only in rumour. The appeal of a secret menu is easy to understand, because it plays on something deep in human nature. People love to feel like insiders, like they possess knowledge the ordinary crowd lacks. Ordering off a hidden menu makes a person feel clever and connected, part of a special club with a secret handshake. It transforms a mundane trip through the drive-thru into a small act of rebellion, a wink at the system. That feeling is worth a lot, and it costs the customer nothing but a moment of self-satisfaction. And there is a kernel of truth at the centre of the myth. Some off-menu combinations genuinely do exist. There are real regional specialties, real known tricks, and real ways to combine standard ingredients into something not listed on the board, since a restaurant that stocks certain items can obviously assemble them in unlisted ways. A determined customer can often ask for a burger built to unusual specifications, and a willing employee can often make it. In that narrow sense, a secret menu is real, in the way that any custom order is real. But the vast, elaborate secret menus that circulate online, with their colourful names and precise recipes and confident instructions, are largely a work of collective imagination. Somebody invents a fun-sounding item, gives it a catchy name, posts it as insider knowledge, and it spreads. Others share it, embellish it, treat it as established fact. Soon there are lists, articles and videos presenting a whole shadow menu, as though it were an official if unspoken part of the operation. The problem is that the actual restaurant has never heard of most of it. This creates a special kind of misery for the workers, who bear the brunt of the myth every day. A customer arrives brimming with confidence and orders some elaborately named creation they read about online, fully expecting the employee to nod knowingly and produce it. The employee, who has been given no such recipe, no training, and no idea what the customer is talking about, is left to either guess, awkwardly explain that no such thing exists, or attempt to reverse engineer the mystery item from a vague description while a line forms behind. The secret menu, in practice, is often just a confused negotiation between a hopeful customer and a baffled teenager. It is a strangely perfect artifact of the modern age, this folklore of food, a myth with no central author, assembled and spread by countless ordinary people, hovering somewhere between truth and fiction, real enough to persist and false enough to constantly disappoint. It says something about how badly people want a little magic, even in a fast food restaurant, even if they have to invent it themselves. The real reach of these empires, though, needs no invention. It is documented, physical and global, extending into corners of the world that once treated the Golden Arches as the face of the enemy. The empire did not stay home. It marched across the world, planting its flag in country after country, and in one famous case the flag was planted in a place that had spent decades treating it as the enemy, When the Golden Arches finally opened in Moscow in 1990, near the end of the Cold War, the lines were staggering. Thousands upon thousands of people waited for hours, some for the entire day, for a taste of the burger they had only seen from behind an ideological wall. For many, it was less about the food and more about the sudden, tangible arrival of a different world. A hamburger had become a symbol of an entire shifting era, which is a heavy load to place on two all-beef patties. To grasp the magnitude of that opening, you have to remember the world it happened in. For decades, two great powers had faced off across a divide of ideology and suspicion, and the American way of life, with its consumer abundance and its glowing corporate logos, had been held up on the other side as the very emblem of everything to be resisted. The Golden Arches were not just a restaurant. They were to many a symbol of the rival system itself, distant, forbidden, and loaded with meaning far beyond food. So when that first restaurant finally opened its doors in the heart of Moscow, it was an event of genuine historical weight. The crowds that gathered were enormous, tens of thousands of people in a single day, waiting in lines that stretched impossibly long through the cold. They were not merely hungry. They were witnessing and participating in something that would have been unthinkable only a short time before. To step inside and order a burger was to touch a world that had been sealed away, to taste, quite literally, the arrival of change. The details of that day became legendary. The sheer patience of the crowds, standing for hours for a single meal. The astonishment at the brightness and efficiency of the place. The cheerful, almost aggressive friendliness of the staff, who had been trained to smile and greet customers warmly. A style of service that struck many as remarkable and unfamiliar. For a great number of those first customers, the experience was overwhelming, emotional even, far exceeding the simple act of eating lunch. A hamburger had somehow become a milestone in world history. It was, in its way, the ultimate demonstration of what these empires had become. They had grown so large, so recognizable, so saturated with meaning, that the opening of a single restaurant could stand in for the shifting of the global order itself. The food was almost incidental. What people were lining up for was everything the food represented. A sense of connection, of modernity, of belonging to a wider and more open world. From there, the expansion only accelerated, until the familiar logos could be found in nearly every corner of the planet, adapted here and there to local tastes but always unmistakably themselves. A traveller could land almost anywhere on Earth and find the same Golden Arches, the same kernel, the same reassuringly identical menu, a strange comfort of sameness spread across a world of difference. The empires had achieved a kind of ubiquity that few institutions in human history have ever matched. And that very sameness, the fact that the same burger could now be found in dozens of countries at once, gave clever economists an idea. If a single burger was sold in nearly identical form all over the world, then perhaps that burger could be used, half in jest and half in earnest, to measure the wealth of nations themselves. The global reach became so complete that economists began using a single sandwich to measure the health of entire national economies. A famous magazine created an index comparing the price of the same iconic burger in dozens of different countries, using it as a rough, cheeky way to judge whether currencies were overvalued or undervalued. The idea sounds like a joke, and it partly is, but it is also used seriously enough that people with advanced degrees cite it with a straight face. Think about that. A fast food burger became so identical and so universal, sold in nearly the same form everywhere on Earth, that it turned into a tool for understanding the world's money. The empire had become a measuring stick. The logic behind the index is genuinely clever, and understanding it will either impress you or lull you gently towards sleep, both of which are fine. Economists have a theory that over the long run, identical goods should cost roughly the same amount across different countries once you account for exchange rates. If a product is much cheaper in one country than another, that difference can hint at whether a currency is priced too low or too high relative to where it ought to be. The trouble with testing this theory is finding a product that is truly identical everywhere. Most goods vary from place to place in quality, ingredients, and preparation, making comparisons messy. But the famous burger solved this problem beautifully, because the whole genius of the empire was its relentless sameness. The same sandwich, made to the same specifications, from the same components, sold in nearly every country on earth. It was, quite by accident, the perfect standardized product for comparison, a common yardstick that happened to exist in almost every economy simultaneously. So the magazine began doing exactly that, gathering the price of the burger in country after country, converting those prices through exchange rates and comparing them. Where the burger was unusually cheap, it suggested a currency might be undervalued. Where it was unusually expensive, it suggested the opposite. It was a light-hearted way to illustrate a serious economic idea, wrapping a dense concept in something everyone could instantly understand. Nearly anyone can grasp the notion that a burger costs more here than there, even if the underlying theory of exchange rates would put most people to sleep faster than this very sentence. What began as a bit of playful economic journalism took on a life of its own. The index became genuinely well known, referenced in serious discussions taught to students as an accessible introduction to currency theory, and updated regularly for decades. People with real expertise and real credentials came to cite it, sometimes with a wink and sometimes without, as a quick and dirty gauge of global economics. A hamburger had earned a permanent, if slightly tongue-in-cheek place in the study of money. There is something quietly astonishing in that when you stop to consider it. A cheap, mass-produced sandwich, engineered above all to be fast and identical, ended up so perfectly uniform across the entire planet that it became a scientific instrument, a way of taking the temperature of national economies. The founders who first obsessed over making every burger exactly the same, standardizing the ketchup squirt and the cooking time, could never have dreamed their pursuit of sameness would one day help measure the wealth of the world. That obsessive consistency shaped everything the empires touched, and nowhere more mysteriously than in the food item people crave above all others, the one whose flavour no home kitchen can ever quite reproduce. For reasons that turned out to be a genuine secret, ask people their favourite thing on the menu and an astonishing number will skip the burger entirely and name the fries. There is a reason those fries taste like nothing you can reproduce at home, and it is a slightly uncomfortable one. For decades, one chain cooked its legendary fries in beef fat, which gave them their unmistakable savoury flavour. When the company later switched to vegetable oil, marketing the change as healthier, the fries lost their magic, so a beef-derived flavouring was quietly added to bring the taste back. Years later, this led to a lawsuit from customers who avoided beef for religious and personal reasons and had no idea it was in there. The most beloved item on the menu came with an asterisk almost nobody had read. The devotion people feel toward these fries is real and a little irrational. They are on paper just fried potatoes, a food that exists in countless forms all over the world. And yet these particular fries inspire genuine loyalty, a craving so specific that people will describe them as their favourite food, better than any home-cooked version, better than fancy restaurant fries, uniquely and mysteriously perfect. Home cooks have tried for years to replicate them and consistently failed, unable to capture that particular savoury depth no matter how they cut or fried the potato. The reason, for a long time, was hiding in the cooking fat. In the early decades, the chain fried its potatoes in a mixture that included beef fat, and that animal fat imparted a rich, meaty, savoury quality that plain potatoes fried in ordinary oil simply cannot achieve. The secret ingredient in the world's most famous fries was, essentially, beef. The potatoes tasted so good partly because they were carrying a whisper of hamburger with every bite, and nobody thought to question it. Then the wind shifted. As the public grew more health conscious and more wary of animal fats, the company faced pressure to change, and it switched to cooking the fries in vegetable oil, promoting the move as a healthier choice. It seemed like a straightforward improvement. But there was an immediate problem. Without the beef fat, the fries lost the very thing that made them legendary. That signature savoury flavour vanished, and the beloved product suddenly tasted ordinary. The solution was quiet and clever. Rather than accept blander fries, the company added a beef-derived flavouring to the potatoes, restoring the familiar taste that customers loved while still frying in vegetable oil. On the surface, the fries were now cooked in plant oil, technically fitting the healthier image. Underneath, they still carried a beefy essence, just introduced through a different door. The magic was preserved. The secret simply moved. The trouble was that many customers had specifically chosen these fries, believing them to be free of beef, whether for religious reasons, dietary convictions, or personal choice. To them, the fries were a safe option, a potato product cooked in vegetable oil. They had no idea a beef-derived flavouring was involved. When this became widely known, it sparked outrage and a lawsuit from people who felt deceived, who had eaten something they had carefully tried to avoid, unknowingly, for years. The company ultimately settled, agreeing to make payments and to be clearer about its ingredients. It is a small story, but it captures the whole strange soul of the industry in a single order of fries. The relentless pursuit of a specific, craveable flavour, the quiet engineering behind a food that seems simple, the gap between what a product appears to be and what it actually contains, and the customer happily eating a favourite treat, entirely unaware of the secret folded invisibly inside it. Not every secret in this story is unsettling, though. Amid all the calculation and concealment, these empires also built something genuinely, undeniably good. And it deserves its moment too. Not everything in this story is cynical, and it would be unfair to pretend otherwise. Amid the lawsuits and the additives and the engineered cravings, these companies also created something genuinely good. Charities were founded to house the families of seriously ill children so they could stay near hospitals during the hardest days of their lives, and those houses have sheltered countless families, free of charge, for decades. It is real, it matters, and it has done enormous good. It is also undeniably excellent public relations, softening the image of a corporation while doing something worthwhile at the same time. Both truths sit side by side. The empire could be calculating and kind in the very same breath, which is perhaps the most human thing about it. The need these houses address is profoundly real and quietly heartbreaking. When a child falls seriously ill and must be treated at a distant hospital, the family faces not only fear and grief, but a brutal practical burden. They may need to travel far from home and stay for weeks or months, and the cost of lodging near a hospital, on top of medical bills and lost work, can be crushing at the worst possible moment. Parents have been forced to sleep in waiting rooms and cars simply to remain near a sick child. Into that gap step these houses, offering families a warm, comfortable place to stay, close to their child, at little or no cost. The idea grew from modest beginnings into a vast network, with houses established near major hospitals in countless cities, supported by the company, its franchisees, its customers, and an army of volunteers. Over the decades, they have provided a home away from home for an enormous number of families during the darkest chapters of their lives, letting exhausted parents rest, cook a meal, and stay together while their child fights to recover. For the families who have passed through those doors, the comfort is not abstract or promotional. It is deeply, tangibly meaningful, and yet it would be naive to pretend the arrangement is pure selflessness with no benefit to the company, because it plainly serves the brand as well. A corporation associated with children's meals, playgrounds, and cheerful mascots gains something powerful when it is also associated with caring for gravely ill children. It humanizes the giant, wraps the logo in warmth and compassion, and offers a ready answer to any critic who paints the company as coldly profit-driven. The charity is a genuine good deed and a genuine reputational asset at the same time, and there is no clean way to separate the two. This is where the easy story breaks down, and where the truth becomes more interesting than either simple praise or simple cynicism. It would be comforting to file these empires neatly under villain or hero, but they refuse to sit still in either box. The same organization that engineered cravings and fought lawsuits and kept wages low also built genuine shelters for suffering families and eased real pain for real people. Those facts do not cancel each other out. They coexist uneasily, the way they so often do in any large human endeavor. Perhaps that is the most honest way to see the whole sprawling story, not as a simple tale of greed, and not as a heartwarming tale of humble founders and beloved brands, but as something tangled and contradictory and very human, capable of calculation and kindness in the same breath. And nothing captures that strange shifting nature better than the fate of the empire's most famous face, the clown who ruled for decades and then, without a word of farewell, quietly slipped away. And so we come, at last, back to the clown. For decades he was inescapable, the beaming face of an entire childhood. But somewhere in the modern age a strange thing happened. Waves of unsettling clown sightings swept across towns, turning the once cheerful figure into something people found faintly menacing, and the company made a quiet decision. The famous mascot began appearing less and less, fading gently from the spotlight until he was almost gone, never officially retired, simply eased out of view like an aging celebrity nobody wanted to embarrass. The greatest marketing character in fast food history slipped away without a farewell. The empire he helped build rolled on without him, larger than ever, its arches still glowing over every highway, its story still quietly stranger than anyone chewing in the drive-thru would ever guess. The clown had been, for generations, one of the most recognized figures on the planet, his face known to children before they could read, his cheerful presence woven into birthday parties and playgrounds and countless small moments of childhood joy. He was the friendly ambassador of the whole empire, a symbol so successful that rival companies could only envy him. For a very long time, he seemed permanent, an eternal fixture of the culture itself. But culture shifts in ways no marketing department can control. Over time, the broader image of clowns curdled in the public imagination. What had once read as silly and fun began, for many people, to read as eerie and unsettling. Clowns became a common figure of fear, appearing as villains in horror stories, their painted smiles recast as sinister rather than warm. The very features that once delighted children, the exaggerated grin, the strange makeup, the unpredictable energy, came to feel to a growing number of people quietly threatening. Then came a wave of strange incidents, reports of people dressed as menacing clowns turning up in towns and lurking in unsettling places, spreading unease across communities. Whether these sightings were pranks, hoaxes, or something stranger, they dominated attention for a time and cemented the clown's transformation in the public mind from a symbol of fun into a symbol of dread. For a company whose beloved mascot was a clown, this was an awkward development, to put it mildly. Their cheerful ambassador was now sharing an image with the stuff of nightmares. The company's response was telling in its quietness. There was no grand announcement, no formal retirement, no farewell tour for the character who had sold so much for so long. Instead, the mascot simply began to appear less and less. His prominence in advertising faded. His public appearances grew rare. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the once inescapable clown receded from view, eased out of the spotlight with the gentle discretion of a company that did not want to draw attention to the fact that its most famous creation had become a liability. It was a fittingly strange ending for a fittingly strange story. The character who had helped build an empire, who had captured the hearts of generation after generation, did not go out with fanfare or gratitude. He simply dimmed, quietly and without ceremony, a victim of the same shifting perceptions that these companies had always understood so well, and this time could not bend to their advantage. The great manipulator of image had been undone in the end by image itself, and the empire, of course, barely broke stride. It rolled on without him, as vast and as glowing as ever, feeding the world by the billions, its founders long gone, its secrets still folded quietly into every wrapper. The clown faded, but the arches remained, humming softly over every highway, waiting patiently for the next hungry traveller, and the next, and the next. So there it is, the whole strange, greasy, glittering empire laid out under the fluorescent glow of history. Tonight we followed it all the way down, from a salesman who could not sleep over 8 milkshake machines, to 2 contented brothers who lost their kingdom, to a colonel with a gunfight in his past and a grudge against his own gravy. We watched clowns go to court and vanish, watched fingers planted in chili and inches vanish from bread, watched a man rig a cartoon game and a burger become a yardstick for the wealth of nations. It is a lot to carry in one paper bag, and underneath the lawsuits and the additives and the engineered cravings, there is something oddly, stubbornly human in all of it. These empires were built by restless, flawed, endlessly determined people who failed and refused to stop, who chased a simple dream of feeding the world quickly and cheaply, and who accidentally reshaped how the entire planet eats. They were calculating and kind, ruthless and generous, often in the very same breath, which, in the end, is just people being people, on an enormous, deep-fried scale. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, with a quiet kitchen down the hall and a refrigerator humming softly in the dark, maybe let go of the mystery of the source and the science of the craving just for now. You do not have to solve any of it. You do not have to want anything at all. The arches will still be glowing out there on the highway, patient and bright, waiting for morning. But that is a problem for morning. For now, let the fryers cool, let the lights dim, and let yourself drift. Good night, and sleep well.